FOE ジャパン主催のオンラインセミナー、バイオマス発電が森林を壊す EU 再生可能エネルギー指令の改定で問われていることにご参加いただきましてありがとうございます。本日はご覧の5団体の協力でお届けいたします。本日司会を務めます小松原と申します。よろしくお願いいたします。はじめましての方もいらっしゃるかと思いますので、FOE ジャパンの団体紹介をいたします。私たち FOE ジャパンは地球規模での環境問題に取り組む国際環境 NGO です。FOE は Friends of the Earth の略で FOE インターナショナルという国際的なネットワークに加盟するメンバー団体の一つです。現在73カ国でそれぞれの団体が独立して活動をしています。FOE ジャパンは1980年に設立、今年で42年目を迎えております。本日のテーマであるバイオマスのほか、森林、気候エネルギー、開発金融など様々な分野で活動をしています。常勤、非常勤合わせて20名ほどおります。私たちは地球上のすべての人々と生物が互いに共生し、尊厳を持って生きることができる平和で持続可能な社会を目指しています。このビジョンの実現に向け、環境・社会問題に対して市民社会の立場、草の根の目線で日々活動をしております。では、本日のプログラムに移ってまいります。まず、冒頭のイントロダクションとして、オンラインセミナーの趣旨と背景説明、そしてプログラムのご紹介も兼ねて、私、小松原が少々お時間をいただきます。はい、本日のテーマの欧州再生可能エネルギー指令ですが、ご覧のように頭文字を取ってREDと略されます。今年9月、欧州議会において改正案が可決され、現在年末の最終決定に向けて残る協議がされています。バイオマス発電には様々な燃料が使われますが、とりわけ森林伐採を伴う木質バイオマスの利用は森林生態系の破壊と隣り合わせです。また燃料の生産、輸送、燃焼と発電の様々な段階で大量の温室効果ガスが排出されるため、気候変動への影響も懸念されています。そもそも火力発電の一種であるバイオマス発電を再エネとみなすことへの疑問もあります。バイオマス発電を重用してきた欧州、そして北米をはじめとして木質バイオマス燃料の生産国を中心に、多くの科学者や NGO、そして市民の間でもこうした懸念が高まっています。日本でも例外ではありません。EU レッドの改定にあたっては、欧州議会の環境委員会から特定の森林バイオマスに対しては EU レッドの補助金の対象から外すべき、または再エネの目標値にカウントすべきではないということを含む提言も出てきました。残念ながら欧州議会で可決された内容は、私たちが森林を守り気候変動を抑制するために必要十分ではなかったようです。そこで今日は欧州のバイオマス政策に詳しいパートナーシップ・フォー・ポリシー・インテグリティのポリシーディレクター、ルーク・チャンバレンさんをお招きし、レッド3の改定がどうあるべきだったのか、欧州のバイオマス発電をめぐる背景、またその議論を焦点をお伺いします。その後、私たち日本はどうなのか、欧州以上に問題が山積みになっているようですが、FOE ジャパンの三田からフィットバイオマス発電のガイドラインの問題点を解説します。最後に30分ほどになるかと思いますが、質疑応答の時間があります。
Good afternoon. Konnichiwa. My name is Luke Chamberlain. I'm the EU Policy Director for the Partnership for Policy Integrity, an organisation that has worked on the biomass burning issue globally for over a decade. The Partnership for Policy Integrity uses robust science, legal interventions, policy analysis, and strategic communications to promote policies that protect the climate, that protect nature, and importantly, to protect people. I'm based in Vienna, Austria. For the past 3 years, I've been collaborating with a coalition of NGOs who are working to have woody biomass removed from the list of eligible renewable energy sources under the EU Renewable Energy Directive. This is because of a simple fact. Burning wood is a false climate solution. Burning wood is bad for the climate. It is bad for forest biodiversity, and it is bad for human health. Prior to this role, I was a campaigns manager for the Wilderness Society, one of Australia's largest conservation organisations. And before that, I worked for 15 years in the corporate sector for IBM and PricewaterhouseCoopers, working in Australia, the United States, in Germany, and also in Japan, where I enjoyed a very nice period of time in the late 1990s, working in Yokohama and Tokyo. This year, I also helped coordinate an investigation into biomass use in Eastern Europe with the US-based Environmental Investigation Agency, collaborating with NGOs in Slovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania. I would like to thank Friends of the Earth Japan, for the opportunity to be with you here today, and I hope that this webinar promotes further robust discussion in Japan about the threat of burning wood for energy in your country. Before we start, I wanted to kindly ask you to please keep in mind this image you see on the screen in front of you. This image shows a recently clear-felled forest in Romania. This is what's happening in reality on the ground in our forests. It was part of an investigation this year that linked the logged forest directly with a large pellet factory in Romania in Eastern Europe. Pellets were exported from this factory to other countries in the EU. Romania is home to the last large stands of old-growth forests in the temperate zone of the EU. These forests are threatened every day by logging, legal and illegal, with biomass production being a very large driver of the logging practices. Next slide, please. It's possible to have the next slide, please. Thank you. And just for the interpreters, am I speaking at about the right speed, or am I going too fast?
Rather fast, to be honest. You're reading a document, aren't you? I wish you had sent it to us, but anyway.
No, I'm speaking and reading, but yes, I will slow down then. So firstly, what is the Renewable Energy Directive? The Renewable Energy Directive, or the RED, as it's more commonly known, it's a central piece of EU climate legislation that is designed to help stimulate the growth and the development of renewable energy. Its origins, as you can see on the left side of your screen here, go back to the early 1990s, when Germany first introduced feed-in tariffs for renewables, and it has evolved until today and continues to evolve, where about 1/5 of EU energy consumed comes from so-called renewable energy sources. However, at the heart of the RED is a fundamental flaw: the burning of woody biomass, wood, trees, forests, however you would like to call it. The RED considers the burning of wood to have zero emissions. This is a straight-up physical impossibility, and hence an enormous and dangerous loophole that undermines the entire intention of the red. A few quick points. Burning wood, as we know, releases more emissions per unit of energy produced than burning fossil fuels. There will always be more carbon in the atmosphere by burning a piece of wood than if we chose not to burn the wood. Burning wood is not CO2 neutral just because somewhere else another tree is growing. This is like saying that smoking a packet of cigarettes every day is perfectly okay for my health because the person on the other side of the road from me does not smoke. It simply makes no sense. Burning wood has carbon payback times of varying degrees, most of which exacerbate global warming. By cutting and burning a part of a tree now, we are eradicating the years, decades, or even centuries of carbon credit that the tree has given us to this moment in time. We must always remember that a tree grows very, very slowly and burns very quickly. You set the clock back to ground zero. Carbon payback times of most forms of wood go well beyond the few years we have left to avoid a climate catastrophe. And lastly, for mill residues coming from the timber industry, there is always something better to do for the climate than to burn. Wood is precious. Burning it disrespects the smart cascading principle of the use of materials on a limited planet with limited natural resources. So therefore, RED's support for wood burning has led to an increase in the logging of forests, both in the EU and other parts of the world, particularly in North America and Russia. In 2020, the EU Commission, as part of the EU Green Deal, launched a vision of the RED in recognition that things were getting out of control. So a very large coalition of NGOs, of which I am a part of, and the Partnership for Policy Integrity is part of, has participated in the RED revision, calling for the removal of support for burning wood. The political realities of wood use in the EU means that this cannot happen overnight. Many communities, including the poorest, have no other ways to heat their homes than from burning wood. Renovations are required to make homes more energy efficient, and these renovations obviously will take time. Increasing the industrial use of wood for energy puts more pressure on these poorer communities. Wood has become more expensive, and our invaluable and limited public funds, when spent on wood, are taking away from making people's homes cleaner and healthier. Next slide, please. When we get to the next slide. Thank you. These figures are a little bit dated. Renewable energy is now just over 20%, but the graph slices are indicatively accurate. About 2/3 of all renewable energy continues to come from combustion, not from wind and solar, as most people think, but from burning something. And let's remember, when we burn, the emissions are seen by the atmosphere. There is no getting around this. And of what we burn, about 60% is wood-based. So hence, about 40% of all renewable energies comes from burning wood. So the question is this a good idea? Next slide, please. And the answer to that question is no, not if we care about the health of our forests. Every few years, the European Union publishes a report called the State of Nature. The latest report from 2020 shows that, again, contrary to popular belief, like many forests around the world, EU forests are in dire trouble. Only 14% of assessed forests are in a good condition. 86% are in a bad or poor condition, and the trend is getting worse. In the last assessment, 16% of forests were in a good condition, so that has decreased since that previous assessment. So let's keep that in mind when thinking about whether more wood should be extracted from forests and burned for energy. Our forests, due to current levels of overlogging, are already under threat. And we must ask ourselves, should we be adding more fuel to the fire by logging them even more intensely? If only 14% of school kids pass their exams when they finish school, would we say that's a good education system? Let's do more of the same. If only 14% of patients entering a hospital came out healthy, would we say that's an effective health system? No, of course we would not say that. We would collectively say that these systems have abjectly failed and that the outcomes are catastrophic. They would need to be completely overhauled, and something drastic needs to be done as a matter of the utmost urgency. It's the same for our forests. EU forests need our help. Next slide, please. What's important about this slide? If woody biomass were an EU country, this graph puts that in perspective. As a member state, burning wood would have the 5th highest emissions of all EU member states. Just think about that for a moment. And despite this, the Renewable Energy Directive considers these emissions to be zero. We must remember the atmosphere sees these emissions. It does not consider the emissions zero. A molecule of CO2 has the same impact in the atmosphere, whether it comes from fossil fuels or from wood. That's a physical reality. Next slide, please. The EU has committed to climate neutrality by 2050. To achieve this, 2 objectives are non-negotiable. Number 1, the EU must almost entirely eliminate atmospheric emissions. And number 2, the EU must radically increase the uptake of carbon in the land sector. And that mainly happens through our forests. So is this actually happening? Let's look at the land sink. Without confusing people with detail, the more negative the purple and green lines are on this graph, the better it is for the climate. The more negative, the greater the rate of uptake of CO2 there is out of the atmosphere and back into the land. This graph clearly shows that the land sink has a trajectory towards the zero line when it needs to go the other way to reach climate goals. The EU lost around a quarter of its annual carbon uptake in the land sector between 2002, when the first renewable energy policy incentivizing biomass use went into effect, and 2020, the latest data available to us. Like the 14% of forests in a good condition, this is another red flag sign that things are going in the wrong direction. The small purple dot you see on the screen on the right-hand side is the 2030 target. We're heading away from this target, and scientists and NGOs have said that we actually need a target towards 750 million tonnes of CO2 a year, well off the graph here. Even though the target is weak, we are still heading away from it, not towards it. The more we delay, the harder the targets get. The feedback loop becomes faster, more dangerous, and before too long, there will be absolutely no chance to reach these targets. This is just a graph, but its consequences for the planet are much more serious. It's that simple. So the question here is there a relationship between the land sink deteriorating and the increased use of wood burning? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. It sure looks like there isn't a relationship. This slide shows the increase in biomass use for energy in the EU. If we could please just swap back and forward a couple of times just to see the relationship between the increased use of burning and what's happening with the land sink. So if we could go back one slide, please. Please go back one slide. Thank you. So from about the middle of the screen there, we see that the land sink is getting weaker. So it's heading more, it's becoming less negative. And back to the other screen, please. Thank you. And that's showing the increase of wood. Next slide, please. Looking at just a small sample of country sink data, forest sink data, and land sector data, the story is the same and worse. Many countries are completely losing their land sink. To share a banking analogy, the interest rate in their bank account of these countries is heading towards zero, and in some cases has crossed. Their economic model depends on the opposite, funding society with the interest on the capital in the bank account. This only leads to one way, the diminishing of the capital and the collapse of the business model. It's the same for forest sinks. We need them to take up more and more carbon from the atmosphere. We need the lines to be more negative, but the opposite is happening. Overlogging and its drivers should be ringing alarm bells at the highest political level. The Partnership for Policy Integrity's director, Mary Booth, will soon publish a report showing detailed data from all member states, and I would be very happy to share that with you when it is published, hopefully at some time next week. Next slide, please. So the red is shown to increase wood burning, with a more than doubling of this happening mostly since 2001. This in turn is destroying the very technology we have to combat climate change. Our forests sink. And if you don't believe us, here are just a couple of quotes from the biomass industry taken from media and from their websites demonstrating the direct relationship between the RED and their business model. Quoted in the Financial Times in July last year, growth over the past decade has been tremendous, says Thomas Meth, Executive Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Enviva, a major US-based pellet producer. The EU's 2009 move was certainly one of the catalysts. CM Biomass, one of the world's largest pellet manufacturers and traders, its website states, CM Biomass Partners was founded in 2009 as a response to the European Union's increased demand for sustainable green energy solutions and the EU RED 2020 targets. Next slide, please. Before we go to exactly what has happened and is happening within the RED process in the EU this year, I wanted to share some real-world context of what has happened on the ground, not on paper, since the RED supported burning wood for energy. But firstly, what about industry claims, as shown here in the cartoon, that only wood waste is used to make pellets and burned for energy? I'd like to now ask the organisers to play a brief video showing the footage from company websites of pellet production in the EU. Could we play the short video, please? Thank you. I think that gives us some clear evidence that we are not just using the waste of timber industry to burn for energy production. Earlier this year, we published a report, which you see here on the left side of your screen, Future on Fire, that demonstrated categorically that stemwood or tree trunks, unscientifically called by some whole trees, are being used as a source of pellet production and burnt in energy plants. I would like to take you through these just to get a snapshot of what is going on. At the top right-hand side, a large energy plant in Germany with giant piles of round wood ready to be burned. Germany has seen an abrupt increase in energy sector wood consumption in the past 20 years. The image on the bottom right is from Austria, shows a perfectly good tree being chipped for bioenergy production at the state-owned biomass facility, just 15 kilometers from where I sit here in Vienna, in Austria. Next slide, please. And next slide. Thank you. Different countries in the EU. It is simply misleading that the industry says only the waste from timber industry is being used to produce pellets and to be burnt in biomass plants. These pictures do not lie. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And also the imports, the impacts of forests overseas in the United States and Canada from the EU legislation here in the European Union. Next slide, please. The pictures tell 1,000 words. Our forests are now being fed into the furnace. They are paying the price for legislation that was supposed to help protect the climate, not make it worse. Why are they logging roundwood to make pellets and burn for energy? Because the Renewable Energy Directive, the RED, has so far incentivized it. It has put its full support behind burning wood, and the consequence is that forests are logged more and more, degraded more and more, lost more and more, because of something that was designed to do the opposite. It's a form of legislative madness. And the issue is becoming so controversial that it is on a regular basis getting more and more exposure in the media, as shown in the next few slides. Next slide, please. And the next slide. Just some examples of very recent media coverage of the increasing controversial nature of burning wood for energy. Next slide, please. And the next slide. So the past couple of decades have focused on the need to stop burning fossil fuels. This is an absolute imperative, but it's slowly catching up to the fact that it's not just fossil fuels we need to stop burning, it's all forms of carbon fuels. And wood, like coal, gas and oil, is a carbon fuel. And that's why over 130 NGOs and over 350,000 individuals have so far joined the call to stop burning wood as a source of energy. This list continues to grow. Next slide, please. Lastly, before we get into the detail of the current process, the tragic war in Ukraine has put the issue of energy supply firmly on the middle of the political plate in the EU and countries around the world. But sadly, the bioenergy industry is insensitively and cruelly taking the opportunity of a conflict to further its own agenda. Here you find the advertisement from the Austrian Biomass Association. Let's burn more wood, they say, and use the image of war to push their agenda. Well, here in Austria, the wood use is already at 150 to 170% of the growth of forests in Austria. Yes, of course, we could burn more, but it will further destroy natural forests and turn more and more of them into simply energy wood crops. An analysis we did demonstrates that replacing only 10% of Russian fossil fuel imports would mean increasing all EU wood burning by 60%. This would need to come from additional logging. Forests are already in a poor state of health, and this will only lead further to their demise. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to the current revision process. The issue of the impact of wood burning on the climate forest biodiversity, and human health are the obvious big three. We've briefly touched on climate and biodiversity issues. The forest sink is being trashed by wood burning, and the forest condition in the EU is in a very poor state. But also, human health is a major victim of wood burning. Biomass heating is the largest source of air pollution in the EU, which is responsible for more than 1,000 premature deaths and per day, and costs billions per year in health costs. Nonetheless, all biomass burning, even using the least efficient, most polluting burners, has so far counted toward member state renewable energy and European Union targets. So more and more health groups are starting to take a stronger stand against wood being classified as renewable energy, and their opposition will only continue to grow. So in a seismic shift in policy, the discussion here in the EU has shifted from how we burn wood and focusing on sustainability criteria to what we are burning and focusing on the types of wood. This is a critical shift from past policy. The atmosphere does not care whether the carbon it sees comes from legal or illegal logging, from sustainable or unsustainable logging. It cares that the added CO2 has impacts that last for decades to hundreds of years. So as such, the term primary woody biomass is now a very important term in the EU. It refers to wood that is sourced directly from the forest. Primary wood is a category of wood rather than a system of logging. The cascading principle of wood is now more important than ever. This basically means that if you're going to log a forest, you should do everything else with wood, turn it into long-standing wood products, recycle it, reuse it, before even considering it to be burned. And lastly, if not burning wood, then what? As I said at the beginning of the talk, the move away from wood burning cannot take place overnight. It will take time, but we haven't much time left. We need to start now. There are obviously other cleaner sources of energy, wind, solar, geothermal, coupled with higher tech products such as heat pumps, alongside the revolution we need in smarter building design and retrofitting older houses to ensure they need a lot less energy to heat in the first place. Next slide, please. The next slide is just a quick look at an infographic that Coalition of NGOs published earlier this year. An additional point that we haven't touched on in detail is that in the EU, the economic cost of burning wood is about 40 billion euros per year. That's a lot of money that can be spent and saved on better technologies, and real solutions. Next slide, please. The European Union has its own in-house scientific agency. It's called the Joint Research Centre, or JRC for short. Last year, the JRC published an important paper on the use of biomass. It's a very long read, and I won't go into much detail here, but I will quickly say that it modelled 24 scenarios of biomass use and found that 23 of them have impacts on biodiversity and climate that are a time frame that is too long for the time frame we have to avoid climate catastrophe. And we can see that on the next slide, please. Thank you. The only scenario in the top left-hand corner there is the burning of tiny pieces of wood. If you could go to the next slide, called fine woody debris. Next slide, please. This is fine woody debris. And this you simply cannot use for industrial energy use. But this is the only modelling that the JRC could find that had a neutral impact, even though the climate impacts of this can still be up to 20 years. Back one slide, please. Back one slide, please. Sorry, thank you there. Forward one slide. I'm sorry, it's just a bit slow on my screen. And down in the bottom red corner, the number 1 there is the burning of what is called coarse woody debris, large pieces of wood. So forward 2 slides, please. And that's what we are using in the EU on a very, very large scale. The other thing the JRC found was that there is 120 million tonnes of unaccounted for wood, missing wood being used in the EU, and we can account this to the renewable energy sector, Next slide, please. I'll have to move through the rest fairly quickly. So in May this year, the EU's Environment Committee, a committee that is designed to give expert advice to the Parliament, the largest of the EU committees, voted for the first time to define primary woody biomass. That is biomass taken straight from the forest. And it voted with a strong majority to exclude primary woody biomass from the renewable energy targets, with some small loopholes. Importantly, it voted to exclude primary woody biomass from being eligible for subsidies, like it is with the billions of euros it receives today. And lastly, it supported the cascading principle of wood. In summary, the Environment Committee raised a huge red flag against the burning of woody biomass. It recognised the problem that this is causing with forest ecosystems and voted for the first time to apply the brakes to its use. Next slide, please. And in September, just recently, the European Parliament voted as well. Because politics, as was said earlier, the strong vote from the Environment Committee has been weakened. However, the entire European Parliament still voted to put the brakes on biomass burning. It recognised there is a problem. It kept the definition of primary woody biomass in the red. This has been maintained with some loopholes. It maintained the exclusion for primary woody biomass to no longer be eligible to receive subsidies. The Parliament changed the Environment Committee's recommendation to exclude primary biomass from targets to a cap and a phase-down approach with vague timelines and implementation. Also, with the cascading principle that remains in the legislation, and again, the details are vague. In summary, the EU Parliament could have voted to continue business as usual, but it did not. Next slide, please. I think, given the time, we will need to skip through the next slides. But the Environmental Investigation Agency, a US organization, conducted in Eastern Europe this year, whilst the Parliament was deliberating, an investigation into biomass, and showed that EU's protected forests, in the next slide, please. Next slide. In Slovakia, next slide, please. In Poland, next slide. In Bulgaria, and next slide. in Romania and showed that we are sourcing wood for biomass from protected areas is being sourced for energy. Just been told I can talk for a few extra minutes, but I will keep moving. Next slide, please. The New York Times was involved in this investigation, and the findings led to a front page story. If the issue of logging for forests for biomass was not on the political map before, it is now. And this story has led to a massive increase in the interest from the media on this issue. And this interest will only continue where there is increased threat of burning wood globally for energy use. The next slide, please. Before I finish up, I just wanted to mention that other industry sectors, and I'm sure there's participants on this call today, are also beginning to get very worried about the use of wood for energy. Prices are going up, competition for the resource is fierce, and subsidies are distorting markets in the wrong way if applied badly, as they are with biomass. Here are just a couple of recent statements. Firstly, Stora Enso. We are under huge pressure, and it breaks my heart really to see biomass going to energy usage or subsidies going to that region, because that breaks all the cascading principles. The European Panel Association applauds that the Parliament resolution clearly recognises and underlines the need for alignment of bioenergy policies with the cascading principle of biomass. The Polish Wood Manufacturers Association. We believe that it is wasteful to use wood for energy purpose, any kind of wood fibre that can be used as a raw material for further processing in the industry. All the more reason why such raw material should not be subsidised. The Portuguese furniture industry. When wood is burned, it cannot be reused or contribute to the decarbonisation of society. This will not be the end of such statements if we continue to try to develop new markets for wood burning. And next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, the RED III negotiations now go through to a trilogue, a negotiation between the Parliament, the EU Commission, and the EU member state governments. The final outcome is yet to be determined, but NGOs are calling for much stronger legislative change and will continue to campaign well after this trilogue discussion finishes. So the actual RED legislation how it will look in the future is still unclear. However, what is clear is that support for burning wood is not as strong as it was before, and it will continue to wane. The new German government, for example, announced recently that it does not support the burning of primary wood biomass as a renewable energy. Again, a seismic shift in political support away from biomass. So the EU Parliament vote was a seismic shift in how the EU regards burning of woody biomass. It has turned it from an emerging issue into a serious problem that needs to be addressed and resolved. It can no longer be ignored. So for the first time, the brakes have been put on the burning of woody biomass in the EU. And nor can we ignore the biomass lobby's misrepresentations of the benefits of burning wood to be allowed to remain in the public sphere untested as social truths when they in fact are the opposite. Industry is becoming much more worried about resource availability and market distortions. There are more investigations planned for biomass, and NGOs will continue to call for all forms of combustion, many of them already doing so, for all burning to no longer contribute to RED targets. And in the market space, the EU Renewable Energy Directive vote has sent a warning sign to the investor community. This is a sector in decline. The low emission sectors such as wind, solar, heat pumps, geothermal, and so on is where the investment community is going and should continue to go. Burning wood is great for a winter campfire to sit around and enjoy, but as a future energy source, its game is over. Next slide, please. So with all due respect, it would be a mistake of gross proportions if governments from around the world would follow where the EU went in the last 20 years on burning wood. Finally, the EU is waking up to this false climate solution. Other cleaner, healthier solutions are possible. This slide is part tongue-in-cheek, but at the same time of deadly seriousness. Burning wood makes the climate worse in the short period we have to save the future. Every dollar, every euro, every yen invested in burning wood is wasted investment. These funds must go to other technologies. Every minute we spend on burning wood is a wasted minute. We don't have these minutes. When we burn wood, we burn the one thing that is against us, time. And now is the time for change. Next slide, please. Our forests need our help. They are the most proven technology we have that can help at scale pull carbon out of the atmosphere to help us avoid the climate catastrophe. We can choose to help them or further destroy them. The choice is ours. Thank you.
はい、ルックさんありがとうございました。日本では EU が進んでいると言って比較しがちなところがあると思うんですけども、ルックさんから写真は嘘をつきませんということで、カナダのブリティッシュコロンビアやアメリカでのペレット生産の写真もありました。はい、とても衝撃だったんですけども、日本でもペレットの輸入元であります。はい、ということで次に、三田からですね、日本の問題点について解説をいたします。よろしくお願いします。
はい。皆さん、こんにちは。ルークさん、お話ありがとうございました。はい。私の方からはですね、日本におけるフィットバイオマス発電のガイドラインの問題点ということでお話しさせていただきます。はい。日本でもですね、2012年のフィット、固定価格買取制度の導入後、ご覧のように、バイオマスの導入量というのが、ぐんぐん増えました。で、注目すべきなのは、この、薄い緑色ですね。これ一般木質というふうにされているカテゴリーなんですが、これはほとんどが、輸入されている木質ペレット、木質チップ、あと PKS、パーム油などがここに含まれています。で、例えば木質ペレットの輸入量なんですが、2012年、7万、1000トンぐらいだったものが、2021年には300万トンを上回るような、そういった、43倍にも、増加しています。で、これはぐんぐん、この先も増えていくことが予想されます。で、大手の商社さんですとか、関連する企業はですね、ペレットの、アメリカとかカナダとかのそのサプライヤーと長期の契約を結んで、大量のペレットを、今後も輸入する、そういった見込みです。で、今のお話にありましたように、単純にその燃焼ということで、 石炭と木材を比べてみたときに、ご覧のように IPCC の2006のガイドライン上でも、バイオマスの、CO2 の、排出量は、ごめんなさい。いいですね。ごめんなさい。木の CO2 の排出量、これはエネルギー、単位あたりの、CO2 排出量は大きいということがお分かりいただけると思います。で、国立環境研究所のこの日本の温室効果ガスのインベントリー報告書なんかを見ても、木材利用の、排出係数ですね。発熱量あたりの、排出係数というのは石炭よりも大きくなっているということです。で、これはそのペレットの形態にした場合はもう少し、排出量は少ないかと思いますが、とりあえず木材の場合はこういったような排出係数になっています。で、今のお話にもありましたように、森林とそして土壌ですね、重要なのは、大量の炭素を蓄えています。で、我々はこれをどう、保全するかということが求められていると思います。で、今までそのバイオマスがカーボンニュートラルであるというふうに説明されてきた背景には、その森林を切ってもまた再生するからということなんですが、その再生するための時間が今のルークさんのお話にもありましたように、森林によって違うんですが、数十年とか、あるいは森林によっては数百年以上かかるわけですね。で、ところがその、伐採が入らなければ森林というのは、これもその、気候帯とかその森林のタイプによって違いますが、維持または拡大していっているということを考えると、私たちが比較しなければならないのは、この両者、バイオマス事業がある場合とない場合の比較なのかなと思っています。これも伐採のやり方によって違うわけなんですが、全く切ってしまう場合、あるいはなんというか、選択的に切った場合とか、あるいはその自然の森を人工林に変えてしまう場合などが考えられるわけなんですが、この人工林に変えてしまう場合は、炭素ストックという意味でも問題なんですが、やはり生物多様性という意味では、壊滅的にこの元々の生態系を変えてしまうということになります。はい。そんな中で日本のフィットの事業計画策定ガイドラインではどういうふうに書いてあるかということですね。で、農産物に関しては、主産物としてはパーム油、副産物としては PKS、そしてパームトランクに限るというふうに書いてあるんですね。で、新規燃料、つまり今まで認められなかったもの、新たに認めるものがあるとすれば、それは非可食かつ副産物のバイオマス種、食料競合の懸念がないものというふうにしています。で、またですね、持続可能性を確認するために、この第三者認証、でしかもいくつか羅列しているんですね。こういった第三者認証により持続可能性を確認することと書いてあります。で、一方、木質バイオマスの方についてどう書いてあるかというと、森林認証制度や COC 認証制度等における認証が必要であるが、詳細は林野庁のこのガイドラインを参照することというふうにされています。で、林野庁のこの木材製品の合法性、持続可能性の証明のためのガイドラインっていうのは、2006年に作られたもので、当時その違法伐採問題が非常に問題になって、政府のグリーン調達の中で、ちゃんと木材とか木材製品の合法性、持続可能性を確認していきましょうねっていう、そういうきっかけで作られたガイドライン。だから古いんですね。でしかもそのフィットのために作られたものではありません。で、このガイドラインの中では3つの方法というのが書いてあって、森林認証及び COC 認証、そして団体認定、そして企業による独自の取り組みというところまで認めてしまっております。はい。で、つまり、ですね、私たちは決してこの、認証制度があれば足りるとは全然思っていないんですが、それにしても、 木質バイオマスについてのガイドラインは緩いなというふうに、皆さんもお感じではないでしょうか。農産物由来のバイオマスについては第三者認証を求めており、かついくつか羅列してるんですね。あれは RSPO2013 っていうものを、これぐらいのレベルは求めたいねっていうので、それと同等レベルのものを、一応議論して、これとこれとこれとこれっていうふうに選んだわけですね。で、ところが、木質バイオマスについては第三者認証を求めていない。で、団体認定とか企業の独自の取り組みというのも許容してしまっています。で、あとその第三者認証についてもですね、認証に詳しい方はよくご存知だと思うんですが、その森林管理の認証と、あと流通過程の認証の2つが合わさって初めてその財の持続可能性というのが確認されるという、そういう仕組みなんですが、FOE ジャパンとかの、アンケート調査なんかでも、その COC 認証のみで済ませてしまっている事例もあるという、なんでしょうかね、かなり何でもありの状態だなという、そういうのが実態です。で、というものの、いろいろな議論は進んでいまして、最近の今年4月の改定で、バイオマス発電のライフサイクルの GHG 評価をしていきましょうということが盛り込まれました。で、その中で2030年度以降に使用する燃料については、火力発電のライフサイクル GHG から、70% 削減を達成すること。で、その経過措置として、その2030年までの間は燃料調達ごとに 50% 削減を達成すること。で、これらの基準を満たすことを FIT-FIP 制度の認定の要件とするというふうにされました。で、ところがですね、これについても問題がいろいろありまして、まずすごく大きな抜け穴があるんですね。つまりすでに認定してしまった案件は対象外です。排出削減の努力、そして情報公開することによって、律してくださいねっていう、そういうことですね。で、あと、その伐採に伴うその森林とか土壌のバイオマスストック減少分については、評価の対象外になっています。で、土地利用変化を伴う場合は評価するというようなことが書いてあるんですが、土地利用変化っていうのはその森林という区分から農地という区分に明確に土地利用が変更されるっていうことで、普通の森林制御はそういうことはないので、大部分は評価されないってことになっちゃいます。で、あとその燃焼分のその排出っていうのは評価の対象外なんですね。この02か03は、どっちかを評価すべきだと思うんですが、どっちとも対象外になっているということです。あと、基準が緩すぎ、ただ、この01から03までのこの抜け穴が大きいので、基準に関する議論っていうのは、あまりどこまで意味があるのかわからないんですが、ただ、これ、大変厳しい基準のようでいて、実はでも、IEA が言ってる、シナリオのうち、その 1.5 度目標に整合するような排出のよりも緩いんですね。だから、この基準をすべてのバイオマス発電が達成したとしても、あるいはすべての発電部門が、こうなったとしても、まだ IEA のネットゼロシナリオというものでは不足しているってことになります。はい。と同時にですね、私たちは石炭火力によるバイオマスの混焼を大変懸念しています。で、経済産業省はですね、石炭火力によるそのバイオマス燃料の混焼を促進しているんですね。これ、発電効率の式というのは、投入したエネルギー分の発電できた発電量ということで、つまりインプット分のアウトプットってことになると思うんですが、この投入したものから混焼するバイオマス投入量を引いていいってことにしたんですね。で、そうすると、今、低効率の 石炭火力発電所は、徐々にフェードアウトしていくというような政策になっているわけなんですが、このバイオマスを投入することによって、見せかけだけ発電効率を上げて、そのことによって、石炭火力を生き延び出せるっていう、そういう、政策が取られているんですね。だからこれ、政策的に推進されているわけなんです。で、これ、しかもそのフィットに認定され、2018年度まではですね、フィット認定の対象になっていたんです。ですから、その低効率なんですが、フィット認定されているというような案件もたくさんございます。これ、FOI ジャパンの、調査したものなんですが、フィット認定されているのが38件、そのうち32件が非効率石炭ということです。で、2019年度以降はですね、混焼はフィットの対象外になるわけです。で、ただこの、政策的に推進されているのにもかかわらず、このフィットの対象外の、バイオマス燃料っていうのは、さっきご紹介した、ガイドラインの縛りすらかかっていないという、つまり文字通り何でもいい。どんな破壊的な伐採をした、バイオマスでも大丈夫ってことになります。はい。あと、ガイドラインの問題点ですね。非常に私が気になっているのが、住民との協議と合意の部分ですね。で、こう書かれてるんです。事業計画の初期段階から地域住民と適切なコミュニケーションを図る。地域住民に十分配慮して事業を実施することに努めること。この手のガイドラインでこの手のことを書くと、こうなりがちなんですが、非常に曖昧で、実際問題、ほとんどの住民が反対して、自治体も反対しているというような明らかな反対がある中でも、実際問題として事業者が事業を、進めていることの歯止めがかかっていないんですね。これはちょっと、今まで申し上げてきたこととはレベルがちょっと違う話なので、これを含めるかどうかちょっと迷ったんですが、一応指摘させていただきます。で、宮城県の石巻市末地区で G バイオという、G バイオバイオマス発電という、これはその液体燃料を使う、日本では最大級の発電計画があるんですが、とても住民の皆さんが反対していて、しかもそれ以外にも問題山積みなんですね。ポンガミアというマメ科の植物から生産される油を使うと住民に説明しているんですが、フィット認定はパーム油で取っていて、で、事業のが実現性というのは、大変低いのにもかかわらず、ずっと宙ぶらりんな状態で住民の方々は不安に苛まれているという状態。すいません。ちょっとこれは、今まで話していたこととは、かなりレベルの違う話ではありますが、住民との、合意ということで紹介させていただきました。はい。すいません。で、FOI ジャパンではですね、こういった問題について、わかりやすいインフォグラフィックスを、最近作りまして、こういったもので皆さんに問題提起をしていこうとしています。で、また、これはですね、去年、作成した報告書ですが、今も申し上げたことも含めて、バイオマス発電をめぐる状況についてレポートにまとめております。ぜひご覧いただければと思います。以上です。ありがとうございました。
はい、三田さんありがとうございました。